The C8 Corvette has been on sale now for 4 years, and it is a massive hit, with one of the biggest factors in its success being its new mid-engine layout that allows it to better compete with some of its European rivals, but at a much lower price point. And the craziest part is that the idea of a mid-engine Corvette isn't new. Chevy's been sitting on it for over 40 years. So today we are going to talk through the reasons why General Motors finally decided to make this massive fundamental change to the Corvette and try to put it in context by discussing the past and the future of the Corvette. The Corvette is one of the longest continually running models in the entire car market. The very first Corvette came out all the way back in 1952. Around this time, General Motors realized there was demand for a small, lightweight, sporty convertible after seeing a lot of World War II veterans bring back from Europe different Alfa Romeo and Jaguar models. And while the first generation of the Corvette, dubbed the C1, had some kind of speed bumps during its early years of production, it would really start to pick up momentum during its final 2 model years, selling something like 11,000 and 14,500 units in its final 2 years. When the C2 Corvette came out in 1962, it brought with it an aesthetic change, but also a lot of new technology. Namely, independent rear suspension that made the car handle and ride a lot better. And then just 2 years later, in 1965, the Corvette would be equipped with 4-wheel disc brakes. And now feels like a good time to introduce somebody who is very important to the Corvette's history, Zachary Arkus Duntov, also known as Zora. And the first thing to know about Zora is that he is a racer. He loves motorsport, competing several times at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And the second thing to know about him is he is often referred to as the father of the Corvette. He joined General Motors as an engineer in 1953 and pretty quickly climbed the corporate ladder there. And while he did not create the Corvette, we can credit him for assuring that the Corvette had a performance focus at its core, and it didn't just become kind of a lackadaisical grand touring car. For example, he helped put GM's small block V8 into the Corvette in 1955. He introduced fuel injection to the Corvette in 1957, as well as helping push for those 4-wheel disc brakes on the C2 Corvette that we mentioned earlier. And Zora certainly deserves a lot of credit for some of these advancements that he helped push into the Corvette. But by far and away, what he is known best for is his obsession with the idea of a mid-engine Corvette. And to provide a little context as to why Zora became so fixated on this idea, we have to look at some of the other models that were coming out at the time and acknowledge that the mid-engine design was quickly becoming the predominant layout for serious performance cars. We can credit the Lamborghini Mira for being the first true mass production rear mid-engine car that came out in 1966. And it was pretty quickly followed by brands such as Ferrari and Lotus coming out with their own versions of mid-engine sports cars. And I also think it's maybe worth briefly touching on why the mid-engine layout was becoming the predominant format for serious performance cars. And by far and away, the biggest reason is weight distribution. Having an engine in the middle makes it a lot easier to achieve the ideal 50-50 weight distribution that a lot of automakers are striving for. And in the simplest terms, a 50-50 weight distribution just means that an equal amount of weight is sitting on the front tires as is sitting on the rear tires. And in theory, this allows the car to maintain an optimal amount of grip while cornering or under braking. And while weight distribution is certainly the primary factor that's pushing a lot of these automakers towards the mid-engine layout, there were some other benefits such as chassis rigidity, a better ride, and enhanced cooling. To shift back over to the Corvette, sometime around 1968, GM was gearing up to release the 3rd generation or the C3 version of the Corvette. But internally, Zora was making a massive push to radically change the development plans for the C4 Corvette. Seeing that the Europeans were having all of this success with the mid-engine layout, Zora was insistent that the C4 Corvette leverage this type of design. And finally, he got the green light, and as a proof of concept, Zora helped develop the XP882. The XP882 was an early concept of what the C4 Corvette could look like. It used the same small block V8 powertrain, but of course in a mid-engine design. Additionally, it also changed the footprint of the Corvette as well. Compared to the C3, it was about 8 inches shorter, but about 6 inches wider. Not to mention about 700 pounds lighter. And something else to consider is GM's competition at the time, namely Ford. They had just signed a partnership with De Tomaso that would allow them to sell the mid-engine Pantera in the US. And this would push GM to showing off the XP882 concept at the New York Motor Show in 1970. There it would be a massive hit, and it would drum up a ton of excitement around the idea of a mid-engine Corvette. This momentum would then lead to GM developing another concept for a mid-engine Corvette. This one is called the XP895. And this concept was even more wild than the one that had come before it. There were some visual changes, but the big thing to know is that it didn't use the traditional small block V8 like all the Corvettes that had come before it, and instead it had twin rotary engines. There was a lot of excitement in the 1970s around the idea of rotary engines, with some people saying that this is the next evolution in design for the internal combustion engine. But of course, looking back now, we know this technology never really caught on. Now, despite all of the excitement that was created around the idea of a mid-engine Corvette, we also have to take into account the other things that were happening in the 1970s. The US was quickly regulating the automobile industry, setting requirements for things like fuel economy, emissions, and safety. Against this backdrop, GM decided that they could not justify a radical design change to the Corvette, citing the decreased demand for performance cars and the massive costs associated with completely redesigning the Corvette. And just like that, the idea of a mid-engine Corvette was put to bed. The C4 Corvette would eventually come out, and it would feature the same basic layout as all of the Corvettes that had come before it. Now, despite the fact that the Corvette wouldn't transition to this mid-engine design for another 40 years, over that time, the Corvette was an extremely successful model for GM. It would establish itself as being an absolute performance bargain, being able to go toe-to-toe with many of the high-end European cars, but at a fraction of the price. And the reason why the Corvette was able to be so competitive in terms of pricing is all about economies of scale. When you look at some of the vehicles that the Corvette competes with, be it offerings from Porsche, Aston Martin, Lotus, or to a lesser extent, McLaren and Lamborghini, all of these automakers are an order or several orders of magnitude smaller than GM. Having this type of scale means that the Corvette can use parts whose cost to develop is spread across literally millions of vehicles. And except for a few special examples, nearly all modern Corvettes use some version of GM's small block V8. This is an engine design that GM has literally been refining since the 1950s, and it's a lot easier to kind of have an engine evolve over the years than it is to develop a new engine from scratch. Now, after that C4 Corvette that we were talking about previously, the C5, C6, and C7 Corvettes all continued to get more refined and add more performance. They outlived some of their main competition from other American car brands like the Dodge Viper and the Ford GT. But somewhere along the line, the Corvette started to develop a problem, and that is that its core audience was just old. Now, besides just getting profit from the sales of cars, one of the main reasons that automakers produce sports cars is to create excitement around the brand. And prior to 2019, the only people getting excited about the Corvette were over the age of 45 and going through a midlife crisis. Additionally, with the C7 generation of the Corvette, it became apparent that they were really starting to push the limitations of the front engine design. And thus, GM decided that it was time for a change. In April of 2019, after years of rumors, Chevy would announce that a mid-engine Corvette was officially in the works and that production would start in early 2020. And it's hard to understate just how much hype was building up around the Corvette. I had friends coming out of the woodwork who are normally only interested in true exotic cars wanting to talk about the Corvette. But the mid-engine layout wouldn't be the only fundamental change to the Corvette. With the C8, they also made the decision to discontinue the manual transmission. And largely, I would say that this was kind of swept under the rug because all anyone could focus on was the new engine layout. Now, while I personally would have loved GM to continue producing the Corvette with a manual transmission, I think the writing was really on the wall here. For the most part, all of the high-end exotic mid-engine cars that the Corvette is trying to better compete with are only offered with dual clutch transmissions. And the new younger customer base that GM is trying to target really doesn't have any affinity towards the manual transmission. But regardless of all of that and my personal opinions as to what I was hoping GM would do, the Corvette did exactly what they were hoping. It stirred up a ton of excitement around the Corvette brand, and it provides them with a platform to build even higher performance versions of the Corvette in the future. And the crazy part is they could have been doing this for the past 40 years. So now is where you might be thinking kind of what's in store next for the Corvette. Well, in the immediate future, there are about to be some very serious high performance versions of the C8. Just to recap what is on sale now, there is the Z06 that uses a V8 engine that is unlike almost any other Corvette engine that has come before it. A naturally aspirated dual overhead cam flat plane crank V8 that makes 670 horsepower, and there is the E-Ray that uses the base model powertrain but adds an electric motor up front to be the first all-wheel drive Corvette. So likely there is going to be a Corvette coming that combines those two different models, uses the super powerful naturally aspirated V8 out of the Z06, and then adds the electric motor up front from the E-Ray. Estimates right now is that this Corvette will have a total output of around 900 horsepower. And there's also rumors that they might be adding turbos to that Z06 engine, potentially with or without that electric motor assist, and that model will be named after our good friend Zora. Additionally, there's also probably going to be a full electric version of the C8 Corvette coming out relatively soon. And even though the C8 generation of the Corvette is already 40 years old, I really do think they are just starting to scratch the surface. But what's maybe even more interesting is GM's aspiration to create Corvette as a standalone brand. Similar to how Ford came out with an electric crossover that they decided to brand as the Mustang Mach-E, GM aspires to cash in on the Corvette's name recognition by coming out with two electric vehicles, both of which being branded as Corvettes. And while for Ford this has turned out to be pretty successful, I am not sure the same will hold true for GM. They have historically made some of the worst marketing decisions in the automotive industry, and they already have several largely unsuccessful EVs on sale today. To be honest, I think this Corvette Sub-brand is probably just going to crash and burn. But hey, what can you expect from the car brand that took 40 years after coming up with the original idea to come out with a mid-engine version of the Corvette?